The most enduring battle of the Cold War was fought not in the silos of Nebraska or the bunkers of the Urals, but in the minds of the youth, where two diametrically opposed visions of human potential competed to define the future of the species. In the United States, the educational philosophy was rooted in the Enlightenment ideal of pluralism, where the classroom was viewed as a marketplace of ideas designed to cultivate individual agency, critical inquiry, and the freedom to challenge established authority. The American student was taught that their value lay in their unique perspective and their ability to innovate, even if that innovation meant questioning the state itself. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet educational system operated on the principles of industrialized indoctrination, where the school was a human factory designed to manufacture the new Soviet man, a perfectly disciplined, ideologically pure collective unit who viewed the world through the singular, unyielding lens of Marxism-Leninism. The Soviet student was taught that their value lay in their total submission to the collective and their unwavering loyalty to the party. This fundamental contrast, education for autonomy versus education for obedience, created two different types of human consciousness, one that thrived on the chaos of debate and one that was paralyzed by the monolith of dogma. And if you watch this series to the end, you will understand how the Soviet attempt to automate human thought became the very flaw that led to the system's intellectual and moral bankruptcy. The role of the teacher as a facilitator versus a political officer defined the climate of the classroom in the U.S. While professors and teachers certainly held biases, they operated within a tradition of academic freedom, where the ultimate professional sin was the suppression of a student's right to argue a dissenting view. The American classroom in the 1970s was a place of radical experimentation, where the Vietnam War, racial equality, and gender roles were debated with a ferocity that often terrified the establishment, but which the system ultimately protected as essential for a healthy democracy. In the USSR, the teacher was a servant of the Ministry of Education and the KGB, an ideological enforcer whose primary duty was to ensure that not a single word deviated from the current party line. Every lesson plan was a standardized script, and any teacher who encouraged a student to think outside the Marxist framework was viewed as a political saboteur, facing immediate dismissal or imprisonment. The American student looked to their teacher for a map of the world's complexities. The Soviet student looked to their teacher for the one true path, a difference that turned the Soviet classroom into a place of intellectual fear, where the most important lesson learned was not history or science, but the art of mimicry and self-censorship. The contrast in historical education and the unpredictable past was a struggle for the national memory. In the U.S., history was taught as an ongoing, often painful dialogue between ideals and reality, where students were exposed to the dark chapters of slavery, the treatment of indigenous peoples, and the failures of past presidents, creating a population that was often critical of its own government but deeply invested in the possibility of its reform. In the USSR, history was a branch of prophecy, where the past was constantly being rewritten to prove the inevitable triumph of the Communist Party. Historical figures were erased from textbooks as they fell from political favor, and entire ethnic groups were memory-holed if their existence contradicted the narrative of friendship of the peoples. This systematic gaslighting meant that the Soviet student lived in a world where truth changed with every new general secretary, leaving them with a profound sense of cynicism and the realization that history was not a record of facts, but a tool of political manipulation. The American student possessed a history they could argue with. The Soviet student was trapped in a history they had to memorize and fear, a difference that ensured the American mind remained flexible while the Soviet mind became brittle. The structure of extracurricular life and the mobilized youth illustrated the state's reach into the private time of children. In the U.S., after-school activities were a chaotic landscape of choice: sports, music, religious clubs, or simply hanging out, providing a space for the development of individual personality and social bonds independent of the government. the American youth culture was defined by rebellion and consumer choice, which, while often criticized for being superficial, created a sense of personal agency and spontaneity. In the USSR, every moment of a child's life was claimed by the all-Union Leninist Young Communist League, Komsomol, and the Young Pioneers. These were not voluntary clubs, but state-mandated organizations designed to military-style precision, where children wore identical uniforms, marched in formation, and were monitored for their political activism. The goal was to eliminate private time entirely. Ensuring that the individual was always under the gaze of the collective, the American teenager lived for the weekend. The Soviet teenager lived for the communist Subotnik, voluntary mandatory workday, a difference that stripped the Soviet youth of their childhood and replaced it with a relentless, joyless duty to the state. The ultimate contrast lay in the purpose of the university and the intellectual elite. In the U.S., the university was an ivory tower where the pursuit of knowledge was, at least in theory, an end in itself, fostering a culture of pure research and radical inquiry that fueled the technological and cultural explosions of the 20th century. The American intellectual was often a critic of the system, a gadfly who pushed the boundaries of the possible. In the USSR, the university was an ideological finishing school, where the production of engineers and scientists was prioritized only as long as they remained politically subservient. Higher education in the Soviet Union required passing rigorous exams in scientific communism and dialectical materialism, ensuring that even the most brilliant physicist was forced to bow before the altar of party dogma. This intellectual lobotomy meant that while the Soviet system could produce thousands of specialized technicians, it struggled to produce the kind of disruptive thinkers who drive real progress. The American university produced leaders. The Soviet university produced servants of the machine, a fundamental gap in human capital that eventually ensured the Western victory in the global competition for innovation. The psychological weight of grading and academic evaluation served as a profound tool of social engineering in both superpowers. In the United States, the grading system was primarily a measure of individual performance and intellectual mastery, where a failed grade was a personal setback but rarely a political death sentence. The American student was encouraged to see failure as a stepping stone to growth, fostering a culture of risk-taking and personal resilience that is essential for a dynamic economy. In the USSR, academic performance was inextricably tied to political loyalty. A bad grade in a subject like history of the CPSU or social sciences was not just a sign of poor study habits, but a formal indicator of ideological unreliability, which could lead to a permanent black mark on a student's personal file, characteristica. This file followed the Soviet citizen for the rest of their life, determining their access to jobs, housing, and travel permits. The fear of this permanent record turned the Soviet classroom into a theater of performance, where students learned to recite the correct answers with robotic precision, not because they believed them, but because the cost of dissent was the total loss of their future prospects. The American student feared a bad report card. The Soviet student feared a political disqualification, a difference that created a society of cautious, hyper-conforming bureaucrats who were terrified of any idea that hadn't been pre-approved by the party. The contrast in campus culture and the right to protest revealed the true depth of academic freedom. In the U.S., the 1960s and 70s saw the university campus become the epicenter of national dissent, where students organized massive protests against the Vietnam War, occupied administrative buildings, and created free speech movement zones that forced the government and the university to listen to their demands. While these movements were often met with state resistance, they ultimately proved that the American university was a sovereign space for the challenge of power, a vital safety valve for social frustration. In the USSR, campus protest was a literal impossibility. Any attempt by students to organize outside the official Komsomol structure was immediately categorized as anti-Soviet agitation. And crushed by the KGB with brutal efficiency, Soviet students were frequently forced to attend spontaneous, pro-government rallies, holding posters they didn't write and shouting slogans they didn't believe, a ritual of public humiliation designed to break their independent will. The American student used the campus to change the world. The Soviet student was used by the state to validate the status quo, a difference that ensured the American mind remained engaged with the problems of its time, while the Soviet mind retreated into a cynical, private silence. The role of foreign languages and international exchange highlighted the difference between global integration and ideological isolation. In the U.S., learning a foreign language was an entry point into a new culture, a tool for trade, diplomacy, and personal enrichment, and international exchange programs like the Fulbright allowed thousands of students to travel the world, exposing them to different political and social systems. This open-door policy ensured that the American elite was globally literate and culturally flexible. In the USSR, foreign language study, particularly English, was treated with extreme suspicion. While it was taught in schools, the goal was often to produce translators for the state or intelligence officers, not to foster genuine cultural exchange. Travel abroad for students was a rare privilege reserved for the children of the nomenklatura, or those who had proven exceptional ideological devotion. Even then, Soviet students abroad were monitored by political minders to prevent ideological contamination. The American student saw the world as a playground of possibilities. The Soviet student saw the world as a forbidden, dangerous mystery, a difference that left the Soviet population with a profound, distorted curiosity about the West, a forbidden fruit syndrome that eventually made them more vulnerable to Western cultural influence when the Iron Curtain finally began to fray. The contrast in scientific research and the Lysenkoism effect illustrated the danger of state-mandated science. In the U.S., the scientific community operated through peer review and open debate, where theories lived or died based on empirical evidence and their ability to produce results, leading to the breakthroughs of the Green Revolution, the computer age, and modern medicine. While the government funded research, it generally did not dictate the biological truths that scientists were allowed to find. In the USSR, ideology frequently trumped the laboratory, the most famous example being the rise of Trofim Lysenko, a pseudoscientist who rejected Mendelian genetics because it contradicted Marxist ideas of environmental transformation. With the backing of Stalin and later Khrushchev, Lysenko's theories became state law, leading to the execution or imprisonment of thousands of real geneticists and the destruction of Soviet agricultural science for a generation. This ideological corruption of science proved that in a system where the party is always right, even the laws of nature must be made to conform. The American scientist was a seeker of truth. The Soviet scientist was a servant of the dogma, a difference that ultimately crippled the Soviet Union's ability to compete in the high-tech revolution of the late 20th century. The ultimate contrast was found in the definition of literacy and the great books. In the U.S., literacy was the gateway to a limitless library of human thought, where a student could read Marx, Smith, the Bible, and Nietzsche in the same afternoon, fostering a synthetic mind capable of navigating complex moral and political landscapes. The American library was a place of dangerous diversity. In the USSR, literacy was a tool for the consumption of state propaganda. While the Soviet Union boasted a high literacy rate, the content of what people were allowed to read was strictly curated by the state. Millions of books were kept in special storage, Spetskran, and the great books of Western philosophy were often replaced by the dull, repetitive, collected works of Lenin and Brezhnev. The state succeeded in teaching the people how to read, but it failed to allow them what to read, creating a population that was technically literate but intellectually malnourished. A difference that made the eventually unauthorized books of samizdat more precious than gold to the Soviet intelligentsia, proving that you can control the books, but you cannot kill the hunger for the forbidden word. The creation of the intellectual elite and the selection for leadership revealed a fundamental divide in how both societies identified and groomed their future masters. In the United States, the Ivy League and elite private universities functioned as a meritocratic, though often class-biased filter, where success was measured by a combination of academic brilliance, networking, and a demonstrated ability to think strategically and independently. The American elite was trained to be flexible, competitive, and skeptical of consensus, a training that allowed for the constant churn and renewal of the American leadership class. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet elite, the nomenklatura, was selected through a process of ideological filtering and party patronage. Admission to elite institutions like MGIMO or Moscow State University was not just about grades, but about the political cleanliness of one's family and one's own record of activism in the Komsomol. The Soviet system produced a leadership class of yes men, individuals whose primary skill was the ability to navigate the Byzantine bureaucracy and anticipate the party's whims without ever showing a spark of original thought. The American system groomed leaders to win. The Soviet system groomed leaders to comply, a difference that ensured the American elite remained innovative while the Soviet elite became a stagnant gerontocracy, a collection of aging bureaucrats who were intellectually incapable of reforming the very system they led. The contrast in youth organizations and the molding of the soul was a struggle for the ownership of childhood itself. In the U.S., organizations like the Boy Scouts, 4-H, or various church youth groups were voluntary, decentralized, and focused on building individual character, self-reliance, and a sense of civic duty. While they promoted patriotism, they were not arms of the federal government and did not demand ideological uniformity. The American child's identity was formed through a mosaic of different influences. In the USSR, the Young Pioneers and the Komsomol were massive state-run monopolies on youth development. From the age of 7, the Soviet child was enveloped in a world of red neckties, military-style salutes, and relentless political hours, where they were taught to worship the state above the family. The goal was the total socialization of the individual, erasing the private self and replacing it with a collective self that responded to the party's commands like a reflex. The American child learned to lead their troop. The Soviet child learned to report their classmates, a difference that turned the childhood playground into a training ground for the surveillance state, creating a generation of adults who were experts in the art of public loyalty and private cynicism. The role of scientific communism versus liberal arts defined the boundaries of what was considered truth in the two systems. In the U.S., the liberal arts tradition encouraged students to graze across a vast field of human knowledge, from Greek philosophy to modern economics, fostering a synthetic intelligence that could connect disparate ideas and challenge conventional wisdom. The American student was taught that knowledge is an open-ended quest. In the USSR, scientific communism was a mandatory multi-year course that every student, regardless of their major, had to master. It was a rigid, dogmatic framework that claimed to have solved the laws of history and social development, treating Marx and Lenin as if they were Newton and Einstein. This intellectual straitjacket forced every Soviet engineer, doctor, and artist to frame their work within a 19th-century materialist philosophy that was increasingly irrelevant to the modern world. The American student learned to explore the unknown. The Soviet student was forced to defend the predetermined, a difference that led to a profound intellectual brain drain in the USSR, as the most creative minds either escaped to the West or retreated into internal emigration, leaving the state's intellectual life to the dull and the devoted. The contrast in campus technology and the information gap became a critical factor in the late Cold War struggle for superiority. In the U.S., the 1970s and 80s saw the democratization of the computer in the university lab, where students were given the freedom to experiment, to hack, and to build early networks like ARPANET. This bottom-up technological culture was messy and unregulated, but it laid the foundation for the personal computer revolution and the internet. In the USSR, technology was a state secret. Computers were kept in special departments with restricted access, and the idea of a personal computer was seen by the KGB as an existential threat to the state's monopoly on information. The Soviet student was trained on aging mainframes and was forbidden from tinkering or sharing data. A top-down technological control that ensured the USSR remained a generation behind in the digital age. The American student was empowered by the machine. The Soviet student was distrusted by the machine, a difference that meant when the information age arrived, the US had 1 million digital natives ready to lead, while the USSR had 1 million bureaucratic clerks who didn't even know how to use a keyboard. The ultimate contrast was found in the culture of the question versus the culture of the answer. In the American classroom, the highest praise was often given to the student who asked the most difficult or disruptive question. A culture that valued the process of inquiry over the finality of the conclusion. This Socratic approach ensured that the society remained dynamic and capable of self-correction. In the Soviet classroom, the only good question was one that led directly to the pre-approved party answer. Curiosity was tolerated only as long as it remained within the correct ideological lanes, and any student who pushed too far was labeled a provocateur or a socially alien element. This extinction of curiosity was the most tragic legacy of the Soviet educational system, as it produced a population that was technically literate but intellectually paralyzed, a difference that ensured that while the US could navigate the complexities of a changing world, the Soviet Union was doomed to be crushed by them, as it had destroyed the very thinking cells of its own body politic through decades of state-mandated intellectual starvation. The ultimate failure of the Soviet educational machine was its inability to produce innovation under a regime of fear, a reality that became painfully clear as the global economy shifted from heavy industry to information technology. In the United States, the educational system's focus on individual expression and disruptive thinking created a culture of entrepreneurs and garage inventors who were encouraged to fail, to experiment, and to challenge every convention. This intellectual risk-taking was the engine of Silicon Valley and the reason the US could pivot into the future while the USSR remained stuck in the 1950s. The Soviet state had successfully produced millions of obedient technicians, but it had killed the creative spark necessary to compete in a world where the primary currency was no longer steel, but ideas. By the 1980s, the Soviet human factory was producing people who were perfectly trained for a world that no longer existed, creating an innovation gap so vast that even the KGB realized the system was doomed without a radical opening of the mind. The American student was taught to build the future. The Soviet student was taught to conserve the past, a difference that ensured the Western victory in the Cold War was not just a victory of missiles, but a victory of the unconstrained mind over the centralized plan. The introduction of glasnost, openness, in the late 1980s acted like a shock of oxygen to a drowning man, as the state finally allowed for the blank spots of history to be filled and for critical thinking to return to the classroom. But the results were not what the party expected. Instead of a reformed Soviet socialism, the new freedom of thought led to a total ideological collapse, as students and teachers suddenly gained access to the truth about the Gulag, the Holodomor, and the staggering inefficiency of the planned economy. The decades of state-mandated lying had left the population with no moral or intellectual defense against the reality of their own failure. The American system, used to the constant, painful exposure of its own flaws, possessed a democratic resilience that the Soviet Union lacked. When the information wall fell, the Soviet educational system didn't just change, it disintegrated, as the very foundation of scientific communism was revealed to be a colossal, tragic fiction, proving that an education system built on lies cannot survive even a single day of genuine honesty. The contrast in intellectual property and the ownership of ideas remains a defining legacy of the two superpowers. In the US, the educational and legal systems were built to protect the creator, ensuring that an individual could own, sell, and profit from their intellectual labor, which incentivized the best minds to stay and build their legacy at home. This created a brain gain that pulled the most brilliant students from around the world to American universities. In the USSR, an idea was the property of the people, meaning the property of the state, and the individual was given a medal and a handshake while the party took the profit and the control. This intellectual collectivization drove the Soviet intelligentsia into a state of inner emigration, or encouraged the brain drain. As soon as the borders opened, the American system viewed an idea as a private asset. The Soviet system viewed an idea as a state resource, a difference that ensured the US remained the world's laboratory while the USSR became a museum of lost potential, where the most brilliant minds were wasted on a bureaucracy that was terrified of their genius. The comparison of self-correction versus ideological rigidity is the most important lesson for any modern society. The American educational model, for all its problems with inequality and commercialization, maintained a feedback loop where the society could learn from its mistakes, adjust its curriculum, and respond to new global challenges through public debate and local control. The Soviet model was incapable of admitting it was wrong, because admitting error meant admitting that the party's infallible ideology was flawed. This infallibility trap ensured that the Soviet Union continued to teach and enforce broken policies for decades until the entire structure simply snapped under the weight of its own obsolescence. The American system was built to evolve through conflict. The Soviet system was built to survive through suppression, a difference that made one system a living organism and the other a rigid, brittle statue that could only be toppled, never reformed. The final verdict on the educational Cold War is that the American model of pluralism and critical thought won because it respected the sovereignty of the individual mind. It understood that the greatest strength of a nation is not a population that thinks alike, but a population that thinks for itself. The Soviet attempt to create a monolith of belief was a 70-year experiment in human manufacturing that resulted in a spiritual and intellectual wasteland. The American student was armed with the power of the question. The Soviet student was burdened with the weight of the answer. And in the end, the question proved to be the more powerful weapon. The Cold War was won in the classroom because the American system dared to let its children doubt, while the Soviet system forced its children to pretend, proving that a society's ultimate survival depends not on what its people are taught to believe, but on their freedom to search for the truth. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital, or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.